I remember the silence before the noise, the kind of silence that feels peaceful on the outside, but is heavy and suffocating deep within your soul. That was where my story began. I was not born into light. I was initiated into darkness. Not the kind of darkness people imagine with horror movies and shadows on walls, but a calculated, organized, and deeply spiritual system that operates with precision and intention. I grew up knowing that there was more to this world than what meets the eye, but I was introduced to the wrong side of it. From a young age, I was taught that power was everything: power to control, power to manipulate, power to influence outcomes without being seen. At first, it felt like a gift. Imagine knowing things before they happen, influencing people's decisions without them realizing it, and accessing knowledge that others couldn't even comprehend. It felt like I was chosen, special, elevated above others. But what I didn't understand at that time was the price attached to that power. There are covenants in the kingdom of darkness that are not spoken openly. They are sealed through actions, through obedience, and through sacrifices. And once you step in, you don't just walk away. It becomes a system that owns you, controls you, and demands from you. I became part of operations that targeted lives, yes, real people. Destinies were not just abstract ideas to us, they were assignments. We studied patterns, habits, weaknesses. We knew that the spiritual realm governs the physical, and we exploited that truth for destruction. There were nights that were not ordinary nights. Midnight was not just a time on a clock, it was a gateway. Assignments were carried out in the hours when most people were asleep and spiritually unaware. We understood timing, seasons, and spiritual laws. We knew that many people lived carelessly, unaware that their lives were open doors, and we took advantage of that ignorance. One of the most dangerous things I participated in was influencing thoughts. People believe that every thought they have originates from within them, but that is not always true. Suggestions, whispers, impulses, these can be planted. We targeted minds because once the mind is controlled, actions follow. Fear, doubt, confusion, these were tools. If we could weaken your confidence, distort your identity, or make you question your purpose, then we didn't even need to attack you physically. You would slowly destroy yourself. I remember specific operations where we monitored individuals who were spiritually rising, people who prayed, people who were drawing closer to God. Those were considered threats, not because they were physically strong, but because they were spiritually awakening. And when someone begins to awaken spiritually, they become harder to manipulate. So we were assigned to create distractions, introduce temptations, and cause discouragement. Anything to stop their growth. But here is the truth that changed everything for me. Even in the deepest parts of darkness, there is an awareness of a greater power. We knew it. We talked about it. We didn't deny the existence of God. We feared it. There were boundaries we could not cross. There were people we could not touch. And it wasn't because we didn't try. It was because something higher was protecting them. I started noticing a pattern. There were individuals who lived ordinary lives, yet they were untouchable. We would attempt to interfere, but it would not work. Their spiritual defenses were strong, not because they were perfect, but because they were connected. That connection, through prayer, faith, and authority, created a barrier we could not penetrate. That was the first crack in everything I believed. At some point, the power I once admired began to feel like a prison. Every assignment came with a cost. Every action demanded something in return. There was no freedom, only obligation. And the deeper I went, the heavier it became. Fear replaced pride. Not fear of people, but fear of consequences, fear of punishment, fear of failing the system I was bound to. I began to question everything. If this power is real, why does it require so much darkness? Why does it destroy instead of build? Why does it enslave instead of liberate? Those questions were dangerous. In that system, you are not encouraged to think independently. You are expected to obey. But something inside me refused to stay silent. I started remembering moments from my childhood, moments of innocence, moments of peace that I had long forgotten. I began to realize that what I was part of was not just wrong, it was consuming me. It was erasing who I was. The turning point came during an assignment that I could not complete, not because I didn't know how, but because I couldn't bring myself to do it. For the first time, I hesitated, and that hesitation exposed something I had been suppressing: conviction, a deep inner knowing that I was on the wrong path. That night, everything changed. I experienced resistance unlike anything I had ever encountered. It was as if something invisible stood between me and the assignment. I felt powerless, not in a weak way, but in a revealing way. It showed me that the authority I thought I had was limited. That moment broke something in me, and at the same time, it awakened something. I realized that if there was a force strong enough to stop me, then there was hope beyond the system I was trapped in. Leaving was not easy. You don't just walk out of the kingdom of darkness. There are consequences, backlash, and intense resistance. It felt like everything around me was closing in. Fear intensified. Attacks increased. It was as if the system was trying to pull me back in. But I made a decision, not based on feelings, but on truth. I chose to seek God, not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. I didn't have perfect words. I didn't have a structured prayer. I just cried out, and something happened. For the first time in my life, I experienced peace that was not forced, not manipulated, not temporary. It was real. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. It didn't demand anything from me. It freed me. The chains didn't break instantly, but they began to loosen. The fear that once controlled me started to lose its grip. The voices that once guided me became silent. The authority that once intimidated me lost its power. I began to understand that true power does not come from control. It comes from surrender to God. Everything I had learned in darkness was a distorted version of truth. Authority is real. Spiritual laws are real, but they were never meant to be used for destruction. As I continued on this new path, I realized how much deception exists. Many people are under attack not because they are weak, but because they are unaware. Ignorance is one of the greatest vulnerabilities. When you don't know who you are spiritually, you are easier to influence. But awareness changes everything. When you understand your authority, when you strengthen your connection with God, when you become intentional about your spiritual life, you become difficult to manipulate. I share this not to create fear, but to reveal truth. The kingdom of darkness is real, but it is not greater than the kingdom of light. What I was part of operates under limitations. There are rules it cannot break, boundaries it cannot cross, especially when someone is spiritually grounded. Today I stand free, not because I fought my way out, but because I surrendered to a higher power that broke every chain I couldn't break myself. My story is not about darkness, it's about escape, transformation, and truth. And if there is one thing I want you to understand, it is this: you are not as vulnerable as you think. There is protection available to you. There is authority you can walk in. There is light that no darkness can overcome. I lived on the inside of that system. I saw how it works. I know its limits. And I know this without any doubt. What is with you, when you are aligned with God, is far greater than anything that comes against you. What many people do not realize is that the kingdom of darkness thrives on patterns, consistency, and access. Nothing just happens randomly. There is always an entry point, a permission, either given knowingly or unknowingly. Back then, we were trained to look for those openings. It could be through fear, through habits, through environments, or even through words people spoke carelessly over their own lives. Words were never just words to us. They were agreements. Every negative declaration, every statement rooted in doubt or hopelessness, created a doorway that could be used. I remember how we studied individuals who constantly spoke defeat over themselves. Nothing ever works for me. I'm always tired. I feel stuck. These were not just complaints to us, they were invitations. Because once a person aligns their words with negativity, it becomes easier to reinforce that reality. And the more they repeated it, the stronger that pattern became. That is why breaking cycles often starts with changing what you say even before you see results. Another thing that shocked me after I left was how unaware people are of spiritual sensitivity. There are moments when your spirit senses something is not right, but many ignore it. Back then, we depended on that ignorance. Distractions were one of the easiest tools to use. If we could keep someone constantly entertained, constantly busy, constantly overwhelmed, they would never slow down enough to discern what was happening around them spiritually. There were environments that made our work easier. Places filled with chaos, negativity, or confusion created a kind of spiritual noise that weakened awareness. In those spaces, it became easier to influence decisions, relationships, and emotions. That's why your environment matters more than people think. What you surround yourself with shapes what you become sensitive to. I also began to understand why discipline is so powerful. Not just physical discipline, but spiritual discipline. When someone becomes consistent in prayer, consistent in guarding their mind, consistent in aligning their actions with truth, it builds a structure that is difficult to break. In the system I was part of, consistency was a weapon, and now I see that the same principle applies in the opposite direction. Consistency in the right things builds strength. There were times when we attempted to create division between people. Relationships were targeted because unity creates strength. If we could introduce misunderstanding, offense, or mistrust, it would weaken both individuals. Sometimes it was subtle, small thoughts planted at the right moment, small misunderstandings left unresolved. Over time, those small things grew into larger issues, and once division was established, it became easier to affect other areas of their lives. One of the biggest lies I believed when I was inside that system was that I was in control. But the truth is, I was being controlled. Every step, every assignment, every decision was influenced by something higher in that hierarchy. Freedom did not exist there. It was an illusion. And the deeper you went, the less control you actually had. After I left, I started to understand what real freedom feels like. It doesn't mean life becomes perfect or that challenges disappear. It means you are no longer bound by invisible chains. It means you have clarity. It means you can make decisions without fear controlling you. That kind of freedom is something the system I came from could never offer. There were moments during my transition where I felt intense pressure to go back, not physically, but mentally and spiritually. Old patterns tried to resurface, old fears tried to return. It felt like a test, like everything I had left behind was trying to prove that I couldn't truly escape. But each time I resisted, each time I chose a different response, it weakened those patterns. I learned that breaking free is not just a one-time decision, it's a process. It's choosing differently every day. It's rejecting what once had power over you. It's building new patterns that align with truth instead of deception. Another thing I want to make clear is that not everything people experience is a direct attack. Sometimes what people think is external is actually internal. Habits, mindsets, and decisions play a huge role. But what I saw from the inside is that external influence often amplifies what is already there. If there is fear, it gets intensified. If there is doubt, it gets magnified. That's why strengthening your mind is just as important as strengthening your spirit. I remember observing people who were on the verge of breakthrough, whether in their personal lives, careers, or spiritual growth. Those were critical moments. Because right before something significant happens, there is often increased resistance. Not because success is impossible, but because it is close. And if someone gives up in that moment, they never see what was about to happen. That pattern repeated so many times that it became predictable. Delay, frustration, distraction. These were common tactics used to wear people down, not necessarily to destroy them instantly, but to exhaust them until they quit. Endurance is more powerful than people realize. There were also moments where I saw the power of genuine faith, not performative, not forced, but real faith. The kind that remains steady even when circumstances don't change immediately. That kind of faith created a barrier that was difficult to penetrate. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was consistent and grounded. I started to see that light operates differently than darkness. Darkness relies on manipulation, fear, and control. Light operates through truth, freedom, and authority. And once you experience the difference, it becomes impossible to ignore. One of the most important lessons I learned is that identity matters. When you don't know who you are easier to influence. But when you are grounded in your identity, it becomes much harder for anything external to shift you. Back then, we targeted identity. We wanted people to question themselves, to feel uncertain, to lose confidence. Because once identity is shaken, everything else becomes unstable. Now, I understand why rebuilding identity is such a powerful step in transformation. It's not just about feeling better, it's about becoming stable. It's about knowing who you are regardless of external circumstances. There were nights when I would reflect on everything I had been part of, and it felt overwhelming, not just because of what I had done, but because of how normal it had once felt. That realization alone was heavy, but it also reminded me of how powerful transformation can be. If something that dark could once feel normal, then something good can also become natural over time. I began to replace old habits with new ones. Instead of engaging in darkness, I focused on building connection with God. Instead of listening to fear, I focused on truth. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. There were moments where I saw clear evidence that I was no longer under the same influence. Situations that would have affected me before no longer had the same impact. Thoughts that once controlled me no longer had authority. It was like stepping into a completely different reality. And the more I grew, the more I understood that awareness is one of the most powerful tools you can have. When you are aware, you are not easily deceived. When you are aware, you can recognize patterns. When you are aware, you can respond instead of react. I also realized that fear is one of the biggest weapons used against people, not always through direct experiences, but through suggestion. If someone can make you expect something negative, you begin to align your actions with that expectation. Breaking that cycle requires courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. There were times when I had to confront things I had avoided for a long time. Not external threats, but internal ones. Regret, guilt, and memories. Those things can be just as binding as anything external. But facing them was necessary, because ignoring them would only give them more power. As I continued to move forward, I began to see how everything connects. Thoughts, words, actions, environments. They all play a role. Nothing exists in isolation. And when you begin to align all those areas with truth, it creates a kind of stability that is hard to shake. I want you to understand something clearly. What I experienced is not meant to make you afraid. It's meant to make you aware. Fear keeps you stuck, but awareness empowers you. There is a difference. You don't need to know everything about darkness to overcome it. In fact, focusing too much on it can be distracting. What matters more is strengthening your connection with what is right, what is true, and what brings life. Because at the end of everything I went through, everything I saw, everything I experienced, one truth stands above all. Darkness only has power where light is absent. And once light enters, darkness has no choice but to retreat. And that is something I witnessed from both sides. As I look back on everything I lived through, one truth becomes undeniable. What feels powerful on the surface can be deeply enslaving underneath. I once believed I had access to hidden knowledge, influence, and control. But in reality, I was bound by a system that demanded everything and gave nothing lasting in return. The kingdom of darkness is structured, intentional, and real, but it is not ultimate. It operates within limits, and those limits become clear the moment someone steps into truth and light. My journey out was not easy, and it was not instant. It required a decision, a firm, unshakable decision, to turn away from everything I once embraced and seek something higher. That decision changed everything. Not because I suddenly became perfect, but because I aligned myself with a power that is greater than fear, greater than manipulation, and greater than any force I had ever encountered before. What I once feared began to lose its grip. What once controlled me became powerless. If there is anything my story reveals, it is that awareness is critical. Many people are not weak, they are simply unaware. Unaware of the authority they carry, unaware of how their thoughts and words shape their reality, unaware of the access they may unknowingly give to negative influences. But once awareness comes, everything begins to shift. You start to see clearly. You begin to recognize patterns. You understand that your life is not meant to be controlled by fear, confusion, or cycles that keep repeating. I also learned that true strength is not found in domination or control, but in alignment with truth. Real power does not come from manipulating outcomes. It comes from standing firm in who you are and what you believe. It comes from consistency, from discipline, from choosing the right path even when it is difficult. That kind of strength cannot be easily shaken, and it creates a foundation that darkness cannot penetrate. Freedom is real, not temporary relief, not moments of escape, but true, lasting freedom. The kind that restores your mind, your peace, and your identity. The kind that allows you to live without constantly looking over your shoulder, without being driven by fear or pressure. That freedom is available, but it requires a choice to let go of what binds you and step into what restores you. My story is not meant to glorify where I came from, but to expose its limitations and point to something greater. There is light that overcomes darkness completely. There is truth that breaks deception entirely. And there is a path that leads not to control, but to genuine peace and purpose. I walk both sides, and I can say with certainty that one leads to bondage, while the other leads to life.